Hi class, today we're going to be talking about incentives. We're going to do a bit of a marginal analysis practice problem because I know those can be a bit difficult to get your mind wrapped around. And then we'll talk about incentives, carrot and stick programs, and how people respond to incentives in very predictable ways. So first let's start off with this marginal analysis problem because these things can be a bit tricky. So let's go through our facts here that we have. We're talking about Ford Motors. And they're trying to decide how many employees to hire. They have a factory and they need to decide what the optimal amount of employees to have is. So some of the facts. Each employee that Ford is going to go and employ is costing them $1,500. In addition to the employee cost, Ford must pay $2,000 on its lease for the factory. And then what is the cost that they were, not the cost, the price that they sell it at is $1,000 per car. So the question is, how many employees should Ford hire? And on the next page here, I'm going to give you a chart here that will show each employee and how many extra cars that each employee adds to the assembly line, essentially. So here's a table of, basically we would call this like a marginal cost table. And here are the number of workers. So when you add one guy, this guy goes and he makes 4 cars on his own. You add the second guy, and the 2 guys together produce 6 cars. The 3 guys produce 8 cars. 4 guys produce 9 cars. 5 guys produce 10, and 6, 11. What you're going to notice here, and this is pretty typical, is as you go and you increase the number of workers, you think that the number would go up, which it does, but it goes up kind of at a decreasing amount. And once you get here, when you go from, for example, 5 to 6, you're only adding 1 extra car. It's the idea of too many cooks in the kitchen, and at some point you're going to have too many people. So it's kind of a simplified example, but something to think about. Now, let's go to the first category here. Well, each car is selling for $1,000. So all you have to do to find the revenue is not profit. There's a difference. Revenue is just the amount of money that's going to initially come into them. If each car is selling for $1,000, all you have to do is take the number of cars times 1,000, and that'll give you the revenue. So 4 times 1,000 is 4,000, 6 times 1,000 is 6,000, 8 times 1,000, 8,000, down, down, down. Now, going to measure the marginal benefit now. When you go and take the marginal benefit, all you're doing is seeing from hiring an additional worker, what the marginal benefit is. So when they go from hiring 0 to 1 workers, you go from 0 to this 4,000 in revenue. So your marginal benefit is 4,000. When you go from hiring the first worker to hiring a second worker, you go from 4,000 to 6,000. So the difference between those two is 2,000. When you go and you hire this third worker, you go from 6,000 to 8,000. That difference is 2,000. When you hire this fourth worker, you go from $8,000 in revenue to $9,000. So the marginal benefit is $1,000. Okay, I think you get the idea. Now let's go to the cost part. The cost part's a little bit trickier than the revenue part, but not much. What you have to think here is there are marginal costs and there are sunk costs. And the marginal cost is going to be the cost of hiring the additional worker, because that is a form of a marginal cost. But the sunk cost is going to be the lease on the factory. So if you remember from the previous page, sorry, I put that up there, the marginal cost is $15,000, and then the sunk cost is the lease on the factory, because you have to pay that no matter what once you're locked in. So this first cost is going to be the $1,500 of hiring 1 worker plus the factory. So that's where I got $3,500. And the marginal cost, I'm assuming, you could read this differently, but I'm assuming they haven't opened up the factory yet. So in this case, choosing to open up the factory itself is a marginal cost. So it is going to be the $3,500. Now, you add an additional worker. The cost goes from the cost of the factory, which is $2,000, because that becomes a sunk cost, and then the extra $1,500. So that's where you get $5,000. And what you're going to see is every worker costs $1,500. So what is the marginal cost column? It's always going to become $1,500. Then all you have to do is you have to go and finally compare your marginal cost to your marginal benefit. So you're comparing this column to this column. And if your marginal benefit exceeds your marginal cost, you make the decision. So there's a lot of writing on here. I know it's getting complicated. So let's compare. Marginal benefit is $4,000. Your marginal cost is $3,500. Does your marginal benefit exceed your marginal cost? Yes. There's the why. Hiring the second worker. Your marginal benefit is $2,000. Your marginal cost is $1,500. Should you do it? Yes. Your marginal benefit is $2,000. Marginal cost is $1,500. Yes. Still make $500. Your marginal benefit is $1,000, and your marginal cost is $1,500. Nope. And at that point, you can basically stop. But you could see here too, as well. Your benefit is $1,000, and then $1,500. So no. And then the same thing, $1,000, $1,500. No. So that's the marginal cost table. Now, when discussing incentives, you need to think about incentives in two different types. There can be positive incentives and negative incentives. So a positive incentive is going to encourage production of something. So a subsidy is basically the opposite of a tax. It's when you pay somebody to do something. So for instance, if I said, I am going to pay you to do your homework, that would be a subsidy. And that would be encouraging your consumption or production, in this case production of a homework assignment. So that's when you basically are going to be paying somebody money. The opposite is a negative incentive. And a negative incentive goes and discourages consumption and production, which is like a tax. And tax, like I said, is an opposite of a subsidy. So the opposite would be me saying, every time you don't do your homework, you have to give me $5. So that would discourage you from not doing your homework. Now, thinking about this is an old school electric car, if the government provides a subsidy on electric cars, what would happen to the production of them? It would increase. And that's what you see now a lot with green energy, and Obama is a big fan of wind, solar, stuff like that. And those are provided in part through government subsidies, which encourages the production of wind and solar energy. Another incentive here that's kind of silly, but justification for higher education. This would be an incentive to go and get, hopefully, higher schooling in order that you have this beautiful Malibu beach house with all these cars, stuff like that. Questions here. These are pretty common sense, but this is what we have to think about as economists. How do people respond to incentives? Would stricter penalties deter this kid from going and cheating on a test? Yes, right? What if the penalty was you were expelled from school if you cheat? This guy probably wouldn't do it. So yes. Drunk driving laws. If you were driving drunk and you were sentenced to life in jail, would we see less people drive drunk? And the answer probably would be yes. So people respond to incentives in predictable ways. You've probably heard it 1,000 times, Economics 101. Question here, drug traffickers in Singapore, if there's a mandatory 5-year sentence for parole with good behavior, what we saw in Singapore is very tough drug laws, and what we saw is very little people trafficking drugs, which makes sense. And this is actually interesting. Different countries, even different states, have different driving under influence where it is blood alcohol content. Where it's lower here in Norway, you're going to see less people driving drunk, where you would see in the U.S. where it's double the amount of blood alcohol content. And if you had with a drunk driver, like I said, like life in jail, in Bulgaria and El Salvador, you can get the death penalty. So we don't obviously see much driving under influence. So hopefully you got some practice on the marginal cost tables. Come and see me if you have any questions. And begin to think about everything that you see. You're going to start picking up on it. Marginal benefits, marginal costs, and people responding to positive and negative incentives.